Welcome to the Fear Files channel. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most sinister and unsolved crimes in American history, which took place in the quiet town of Villisca, Iowa, more than 100 years ago. The night of June 9th to 10th, 1912, forever changed this small rural town with a population of about 2,000 people. In those days, Villisca was a typical provincial place where everyone knew each other. The doors of houses were rarely locked, and crime was an almost unknown concept. Residents felt completely safe, and no one could imagine that their quiet life was about to turn into a nightmare. At the center of this tragic story was the Moore family. Josiah Moore was a successful entrepreneur who sold agricultural machinery. He was 43 years old and had a good reputation in the city. His wife, Sarah, was 39 years old and was known as a caring mother and an active member of the local Presbyterian church. The couple had 4 children: 11-year-old Herman, 10-year-old Catherine, 7-year-old Boyd, and 5-year-old Paul. The family was considered exemplary and respected in the community. The 9th of June was an ordinary Sunday. The Moore family, as befits devout Christians, went to a service in the Presbyterian church. After the service, the church hosted a special event for children, a program called Children's Day, where young parishioners sang songs and recited poems. The Moore's daughters, Catherine and her younger sister, took an active part in this celebration. The atmosphere was joyful and carefree. No one had a premonition of impending trouble. After the end of the church program, the Moore family invited 2 girls, friends of their daughters, to visit them. They were Lena and Ina Stillinger, sisters of 8 and 12. Their parents gave permission for an overnight stay, not suspecting that they would never see their daughters alive again. The girls gladly agreed to stay because the opportunity to spend the night with their friends seemed like a real adventure to them. At about 10 o'clock in the evening, the entire group returned to the Moore's house, which was located on the corner of 2nd and East Sherman Streets. Neighbors saw the family enter the house, and no one else was seen alive. What exactly happened in the house in the following hours remains a mystery, but the investigation later determined that the perpetrator was most likely already inside or entered shortly after the family's return. The Moore house was a typical 2-story building of that time. On the ground floor, there was a living room, a dining room, and a kitchen, and upstairs there were bedrooms. On that fateful night, the adults went to sleep on the first floor in one of the rooms. The children were accommodated upstairs in 2 bedrooms. The Stillinger girls slept in the guest room. Everyone fell asleep, unaware of the horror that awaited them. The morning of the 10th of June began with anxious premonitions. Mary Peckham, a neighbor of the Moore family, noticed that there was an unusual silence in the house. Usually, by 7 in the morning, the family was already on their feet. The children went out to play in the yard, and Josiah went about his business. But on this day, all the curtains were drawn, the door remained closed, and there was not a single sign of life. Mary knocked on the door, but no one answered. Worried, she called Josiah's brother, who ran in with the key. When the door opened, they were greeted by an ominous silence. The first thing they found was the body of Josiah and Sarah Moore in a bedroom on the first floor. The scene was so horrific that Josiah's brother immediately called the police. Marshal Hank Horton arrived at the scene and discovered the scale of the tragedy. Going upstairs, he found the bodies of all 4 more children and 2 Stillinger girls. 8 people, including 4 young children, were brutally killed with an axe while they slept. The crime scene was nightmarish. All the victims were in their beds, their heads disfigured by multiple blows of the axe. The killer acted with incredible cruelty, striking even after the victims were dead. The walls and ceilings were spattered with blood, and the bed linen was soaked through with it. The investigation found that the adults on the first floor were killed first. Then the offender went upstairs and methodically dealt with the children. Especially horrific was the death of the Stillinger girls. The eldest of them, 12-year-old Lena, was found to have protective wounds on her arms, indicating that she was trying to defend herself or had woken up during the attack. Her body also showed signs of possible sexual abuse, although the medical examination of the time could not confirm this for sure. The younger Anna was killed in the same room before she knew what was happening. The murder weapon was found in the guest bedroom, where the bodies of the Stillinger girls were located. It was an axe that belonged to Josiah Moore himself, which he kept in a shed in the yard. The killer took it before committing the crime or during it. The hair and blood of the victims remained on the axe, but no fingerprints were found. The handle was wrapped in fabric, which indicated the caution of the criminal. When the police inspected the house, they found many strange details that made the case even more sinister. All mirrors in the house were covered with clothes or fabric. The windows were tightly curtained, and in some places the cracks between the curtains were plugged with rags. This behavior could indicate the superstition of the killer, who was afraid that the souls of the victims would see his reflection, or it could simply be a precaution to prevent light from penetrating during the commission of the crime. In the kitchen, a half-eaten piece of bacon and a plate were found on the table, which allowed the investigation to assume that the killer remained in the house after the crime and even had a snack. This spoke of composure and lack of haste. A bowl of bloody water was found in one of the rooms. Probably the killer was trying to wash the blood off his hands. A blood-stained kerosene lamp was also found, which he used to light his way through the dark. The news of the massacre instantly spread throughout the city. People were shocked and horrified. Hundreds of curious residents of Villisca and the surrounding towns rushed to the Moore's house to see the crime scene with their own eyes. Unfortunately, in those days, the methods of preserving the crime scene were far from modern standards. Crowds of people entered the house, touched objects, took pieces of wallpaper and other things as a souvenir, hopelessly polluting the crime scene and destroying potential evidence. The funeral of the 8 victims turned into one of the biggest and most tragic events in the history of Villisca. The bodies were displayed at the local burial parlor, and thousands of people came to bid farewell to the dead. The procession to the cemetery stretched for several blocks. The city was immersed in mourning, and an atmosphere of fear and distrust settled in every house. Residents began to lock the doors at night, which was previously unusual for this quiet place. The investigation began immediately, but faced serious difficulties. The police were completely unprepared for a crime of this magnitude. There were no experienced detectives in the city, and Marshal Horton was forced to seek the help of private investigators and investigators from other cities. Agents of the Burns Private Detective Agency, which at that time was one of the most famous in the country, were involved. There were many theories and suspects. First of all, the investigation drew attention to local residents who could have a motive for the murder. One of the main suspects was a man named Frank Jones, a former employer and business partner of Josiah Moore. There was a business conflict between them, and Josiah at some point left Jones and became his competitor. Some believe that Jones might have hired an assassin to get revenge on Moore. However, no direct evidence of Jones' involvement has ever been found. He had an alibi for the night of the murder, and he always denied his guilt. However, rumors of his possible involvement continued to circulate in the city over the years, dividing the community into those who believed in his guilt and those who defended him. Another suspect was William Mansfield, an itinerant preacher who was in Villisca on the day of the murder. Mansfield was a man with an unstable psyche, and his behavior aroused suspicion. He left the city on the morning train on June 10th, shortly after the bodies were discovered. Witnesses claimed to have seen him with bloody clothes at the train station. When he was detained for interrogation, he behaved strangely and even confessed to the murder, but later retracted his testimony. Mansfield was handed over to the authorities and placed in a psychiatric hospital, where he was examined by doctors. They concluded that he suffers from mental disorders and is prone to fantasies. His confessions were inconsistent and often contradicted known facts. In the end, the court found him insane, and he spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital without ever being formally charged with murder. Another suspect was Henry Moore, not a relative of the deceased family, who was detained for committing similar crimes elsewhere. In 1912, a series of axe murders swept through the Midwest, and many of them had similarities to the murder in Villisca. The victims were killed in their sleep, an axe was used, and mirrors were hung. The investigation tried to establish a connection between these crimes, but no convincing evidence was found that they were all committed by one person. Over the years, interest in the business did not fade. Journalists, writers, and researchers continue to study this crime, putting forward new theories and versions. Some believe that the killer was a local resident who knew his family and home well. Others believe that it was a random maniac who chose the Moore house spontaneously. It has been suggested that the motive could be revenge, jealousy, or even ritual murder. The Moore's house in Villisca stood in its place for many years after the tragedy. For a long time, it stood abandoned, becoming a place of pilgrimage for the curious and ghost hunters. Locals avoided it, telling stories of strange sounds and ghosts that supposedly roamed the rooms. In the end, the house was purchased and turned into a kind of museum dedicated to those tragic events. Today, the house is open to the public, and anyone can walk through the rooms where this terrible crime took place. Many visitors claim to feel an inexplicable presence there and hear strange sounds. There are even night tours for the bravest who want to spend the night in the house where one of the most horrific mass murders in American history took place over a century ago. Despite the fact that more than 100 years have passed, the case of the murder of the Moore family remains officially unsolved. The police were never able to gather enough evidence to charge anyone. This is one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in the criminal history of the United States, which continues to excite the minds of researchers, criminologists, and lovers of mysterious crimes. Modern criminologists and historians who study this case apply the latest methods of analysis, trying to find answers to questions that their predecessors could not solve. With the help of modern technologies, they review old photographs from the crime scene, analyze archival documents, and witness testimonies. Some experts have attempted to build a psychological profile of the killer based on the nature of the crime and the details left at the scene. According to the profilers, the killer was probably a man between the ages of 20 and 40, physically strong, capable of inflicting multiple blows with an axe. His actions testified to a certain organization. He found an axe in advance, hung mirrors and windows, remained in the house after the crime, showing no signs of panic. This suggests that he was either a cold, calculated psychopath or was in a state of psychosis that gave him a strange calm. A particularly disturbing aspect of this crime is the question of motive. Nothing was stolen from the house. Money and valuables remained untouched, which excluded the version of robbery. No notes or messages have been found that could explain why this particular family was chosen. The killer left no obvious clues about his identity or the reasons for his terrible act. Some researchers suggest that the killer may have been acquainted with the Moore family, perhaps even attending a church service that Sunday. He could keep an eye on the family, know their daily routines, and choose this particular night because he knew about the presence of the Stillinger girls in the house. This theory is supported by the fact that the killer seems to have known the layout of the house and acted confidently in the dark. Another version suggests that the perpetrator was a serial killer who traveled around the country committing similar crimes. Between 1911 and 1912, a series of similar murders occurred in several Midwestern states, where the victims were killed with an axe in their sleep. These crimes had much in common. The attack took place at night, an axe or similar weapon was used, and entire families became victims. However, it was not possible to connect all these cases together and find a common criminal. Interestingly, after the murder in Villisca, such crimes stopped, which led some researchers to believe that the killer was either caught in another case or died, or ceased his activities for some unknown reasons. He may have left the country or been placed in a psychiatric hospital under a different name. The tragedy in Villisca had a profound impact on American society at the time. Newspapers across the country published details of this horrific crime, and fear of the unknown killer spread to many cities and towns. People have started to take the security of their homes more seriously, install locks, and be more vigilant of strangers. History has also influenced the development of forensic science in America. This case showed the need for a professional approach to the investigation of serious crimes, the importance of keeping the crime scene intact, and the need for coordination between law enforcement agencies in different regions. Many of the methods that seem obvious today were just beginning to develop. The families of the victims continued to live with the pain of this loss throughout their lives. The parents of the Stillinger girls never recovered from the death of their daughters. They left Villisca, unable to stay in a place that reminded them of the tragedy. Relatives of the Moore family were also deeply traumatized by what happened, and this tragedy changed their lives forever. The town of Villisca had never been the same after that night. The community, which was once cohesive and trusting, has splintered into groups that are suspicious of each other. The atmosphere of fear and distrust persisted for years. Neighbors who had previously left their doors unlocked and talked freely now looked at each other suspiciously, wondering if the killer was living among them. Over the decades, people have occasionally appeared in Villisca, claiming to know who the murderer was, or even confessing to the crime. All of these allegations have been carefully verified, but none of them has led to the disclosure of the case. Some were obvious dreamers, others suffered from mental disorders, and still others were just looking for attention. Police records contain hundreds of pages of witness statements, investigation reports, photographs, and other materials related to the case. Researchers and journalists continue to study these archives, hoping to find an overlooked detail that could shed light on the identity of the killer. However, every year the hope that this mystery will be solved becomes less and less. Some theories suggest that the killer did not act alone. Perhaps he had an accomplice who was helping him or waiting outside. This version is based on the fact that it would be extremely difficult to commit such a crime alone, especially given the need to control 8 people and act silently so as not to wake the neighbors. However, no evidence of the presence of a second person was found. Psychologists who have studied this case note the unusual cruelty of the killer. The number of blows inflicted on each victim far exceeded what was necessary to kill them. This indicates the intense rage or hatred felt by the perpetrator. Perhaps he knew the victims personally and had some negative feelings about them. Or he suffered from a severe mental disorder that forced him to act with such excessive cruelty. The hanging of mirrors remains one of the most mysterious details of this case. In different cultures, there are superstitions related to mirrors and death. Some believe that the souls of the dead can be trapped in mirrors. Others believe that mirrors should be covered to prevent the spirits from returning. Perhaps the killer held some superstitious beliefs, or it was a practical solution to prevent the reflection of the light of the lamp, which could attract the attention of neighbors. Modern Ghostbusters and paranormal researchers often visit the Moore's home, claiming that it is one of the most active places in terms of paranormal activity. They report strange sounds, children's voices, shadow movements, and other unexplained phenomena. Skeptics, of course, attribute all this to a play of imagination and natural causes. But ghost stories continue to attract numerous visitors to the house. The owners of the house have turned it into a kind of horror museum where excursions are held, and it is even allowed to spend the night for a fee. Inside the house, the atmosphere has been preserved as close as possible to that on the night of the murder. Visitors can see the rooms where the victims slept, see a replica of the axe with which the crime was committed, and learn the details of the investigation. Many visitors admit that the atmosphere in the house is really heavy and depressing. Even those who do not believe in the paranormal have noted a strange feeling of discomfort and anxiety that they experience inside. Perhaps this is due to the knowledge of what happened here, or the house really retains the echoes of that terrible night. The story of a murder in Villisca has become part of American pop culture. Books have been written about her, documentaries have been made, episodes of television shows dedicated to unsolved crimes have been created. This case is mentioned in various lists of the most mysterious and horrific murders in American history. It continues to attract the attention of new generations who are trying to find answers to questions that have remained unanswered for more than a century. One of the most intriguing aspects of the investigation was the discovery that the killer had spent a significant amount of time in the house after committing the crime. This was established not only by the uneaten food in the kitchen, but also by other details. In one of the rooms, a cigarette was found, which someone smoked after the murder. Cigarette butts were found in several places, suggesting that the perpetrator was in no hurry to leave the scene of the crime and felt confident enough to stay there for a while. This behavior is highly unusual for most murderers, who usually seek to flee the scene of the crime as quickly as possible. The fact that this person stayed, perhaps for several hours, indicates either his extreme self-confidence or a mental disorder that deprived him of a normal sense of self-preservation. Some experts believe that the killer may have enjoyed his crime by being near the bodies of the victims, which is common in a certain type of serial killer. The investigation also drew attention to strange traces found near the house. Someone had been standing under the window of one of the bedrooms for a long time, as evidenced by deep imprints in the ground. This suggested that the killer may have been watching the family through a window before entering the house, or that he was standing there after the crime, perhaps contemplating what to do next, or simply contemplating the result of his work. The Villisca railway station became an important element of the investigation. It was not far from the Moore's house, and the investigation assumed that the killer could have arrived in the city by train and left it in the same way. All the station employees and passengers of the trains that passed through Villisca that night and the morning after the murder were interviewed. Several witnesses reported suspicious individuals, but none of these testimonies led to concrete results. One witness was a station agent who claimed to have seen a man with a bloody shirt boarding the morning train. However, his description was too vague, and it was not possible to establish the identity of this person. By the time the police began to seriously consider this theory, the potential suspect could already be hundreds of miles away from Villisca. Another detail that puzzled the investigators concerned the behavior of the family dog. The Moores had a dog that usually slept in the yard and was known for being vigilant. It is strange that the dog did not bark that night, although a stranger broke into the house and something terrible happened there. This led to speculation that the dog might have known the killer, again pointing to the possibility that the perpetrator was someone from the family's acquaintances. At that time, in America, there was a practice of involving clairvoyants and mediums in the investigation of complex crimes. Desperate to find the killer by traditional methods, the Villisca authorities turned to several such people for help. They came to the city, held seances, claimed that they communicated with the spirits of the dead, and received clues from them about the identity of the killer. Of course, none of these revelations led to the disclosure of the crime, but they added an additional atmosphere of mysticism and horror around this case. The press of that time actively covered the events in Villisca, and this coverage was not always responsible. Newspapers published sensational headlines, exaggerated facts, and sometimes simply made up details to increase sales. This created an atmosphere of hysteria around the case and contributed to the spread of rumors and false information, which only complicated the work of the investigation. One of the newspapers even offered a reward for information that would lead to the capture of the killer. The amount was quite significant for the time, and it caused a flood of messages from people claiming to know something important. The police had to check hundreds of useless clues, wasting valuable time and resources investigating false leads. The lawsuits related to this case have also attracted a lot of public attention. When William Mansfield appeared in court, the courtroom was crowded with journalists and curious spectators. The trial turned into a real media show, where lawyers from both sides made fiery speeches and witnesses gave contradictory testimonies. Ultimately, as mentioned, Mansfield was declared insane and sent to a mental hospital. Interestingly, during Mansfield's stay in hospital, he continued to make contradictory statements about his involvement in the crime. Sometimes he described in detail how he committed the murder, including details that were not published in the press. This forced investigators to return to him again and again, trying to understand whether he was really a murderer or just a mentally ill man with a rich imagination. Doctors who observed Mansfield noted that he suffered from what today could be diagnosed as schizophrenia or another serious mental disorder. He had periods of clarity when he behaved normally and denied his involvement in the murder, and periods of cloudiness when he claimed otherwise. This unpredictability of his testimony made it impossible to use it as evidence in court. The version of Frank Jones' involvement also continued to develop even years after the crime. Some researchers believe that Jones had not only a financial motive related to the business conflict with Josiah Moore, but also a personal one. There have been rumors, though unproven, that Sarah Moore and Frank Jones may have had a romantic relationship in the past, or that Jones had feelings for her. If these rumors were well-founded, this could explain the passionate rage of the murderer. According to this theory, Jones may have hired someone to carry out the murder, possibly the same William Mansfield who worked as a preacher and may have had connections to Jones through the church. However, no direct evidence of a connection between these two men has been found, and this version remains only speculation. Frank Jones' descendants have defended his reputation for decades, claiming that he was innocent and a victim of rumors and prejudice. They pointed out that Jones had a solid alibi for the night of the murder and that he was a respected member of society who could not have committed or ordered such a horrific crime. Nevertheless, a shadow of suspicion continued to haunt Jones' name even after his death. In 1917, 5 years after the assassination, an incident occurred that brought the case back to the spotlight. A certain Henry Lee Moore, who was not related to the Moore family of Villisca, was arrested for a series of similar murders in other states. His methods were strikingly similar. He attacked families at night, used an axe, killed everyone in the house. Investigators tried to determine whether this man might have been responsible for the murder in Villisca, but no conclusive evidence of his presence in Iowa in June 1912 was found. Henry Lee Moore was convicted of other crimes and sentenced to life in prison. Until the end of his days, he denied involvement in the murder in Villisca, although he admitted other crimes he had committed. Some researchers still consider him the most likely suspect, pointing to the coincidence of methods and the time period of his criminal activity. Another theory suggested that the killer could have been one of the traveling workers, of which there were many in the Midwest at the time. These people moved from city to city, working on farms, railroads, and other temporary jobs. They left no trace and were difficult to trace. Perhaps one of these people ended up in Villisca that night, committed a crime, and left, blending in with thousands of other migrant workers. The families of the victims have long hoped for justice. The parents of the Stillinger girls, in particular, were heartbroken and demanded that the authorities find the killer of their daughters. They offered their own rewards, hired private detectives, and did everything they could to ensure that the case was not forgotten. However, over time, they were forced to accept that the killer might never be found. The tragedy in Villisca affected the lives of not only the immediate relatives of the victims, but also the entire city. The town's economy suffered, as many people were afraid to move there or do business there. Villisca's reputation as a safe and quiet place was shattered, and it took years for the city to begin to recover from this blow. Local residents who survived those events passed on stories about that terrible night from generation to generation. The old-timers of the city told their children and grandchildren about how life changed after the murder, how people stopped trusting each other, how every stranger aroused suspicion. These memories became part of Villisca's collective memory, forever linking the city to one of the darkest crimes in American history. In the 1930s and 1940s, interest in the business waned somewhat, in part due to the Great Depression and World War II, which diverted public attention to more pressing issues. The Moore house passed from owner to owner, and no one wanted to live there for long. Most of the people who bought this house were unaware of its dark history, but when they found out, they rushed to get rid of it. The building was gradually falling into disrepair, and it seemed that it would be demolished. However, in the 60s, there was a revival of interest in unsolved crimes and paranormal phenomena. Journalists and writers began to investigate the Villisca murder case again, publishing articles and books that reviewed old evidence and put forward new theories. The house was saved from demolition and gradually turned into a tourist attraction, attracting people from all over the country. One of the most detailed books about the case was written by a local historian who spent years studying archival material and interviewing descendants of those who witnessed the events. His work has become an important source of information for anyone interested in this crime. He was able to reconstruct many details that had been lost or distorted over time, and provided the most complete picture of what happened that night and the subsequent investigation. Modern criminologists note that if such a crime had occurred today, the investigation would have been conducted completely differently. DNA analysis, computer databases, modern forensic techniques, and coordination between law enforcement agencies at the national level would greatly increase the chances of solving crime. Unfortunately, in 1912, such tools did not exist, and the investigation had to rely on witness testimony, physical evidence, and intuition. Some researchers have tried to apply modern methods to old evidence. Photographs from the crime scene were studied using computer analysis. Forensic medical reports were revised from the point of view of modern pathology, and the handwriting of the suspects was analyzed. However, there is virtually no physical evidence that could be subjected to DNA testing or other modern research methods. Most materials have been lost, destroyed, or damaged by improper storage. One of the most disturbing aspects of this case is the fact that if the killer was indeed a serial criminal, then the murder in Villisca could only be one of many. Across the Midwest, there were more than 24 similar murders between 1910 and 1912. Entire families were killed with an axe in their sleep, and in many cases, the perpetrator was never caught. Perhaps the same person was responsible for several or even all of these crimes. If so, then we are facing one of the first serial killers in American history, whose identity has remained unknown. This man could act for several years, traveling from city to city, choosing his victims and disappearing into the night. The idea that such a person could live among ordinary people, perhaps have a family and a job, and yet commit such horrific crimes is particularly terrifying. Psychologists who study the behavior of serial killers note that the perpetrator of the Villisca murder showed signs of what modern criminology calls an organized killer. He planned his actions, brought tools, or used those found at the scene, monitored the crime scene, and took precautions to avoid being detected. This is different from chaotic, impulsive murders committed in a fit of passion or madness. At the same time, some aspects of the crime point to disorganized elements. Excessive cruelty, failure to hide bodies or cover tracks, and a decision to remain at the scene of the crime. This mixture of organized and disorganized characteristics makes the psychological profile of the killer particularly complex and ambiguous. Over the years, some residents of Villisca have begun to perceive the tragedy as part of their town's history, which cannot be changed, but can be used as a reminder of the fragility of human life and the importance of safety. Local schools sometimes include the study of this case in the history of the region, although this is always done with caution and respect for the memory of the victims. The tourist business around the Moore's house causes mixed feelings among the residents of the city. Some believe that this is disrespectful to the memory of the victims, turning the tragedy into entertainment. Others believe that keeping a home and conducting excursions helps not to forget about sacrifices and the importance of justice. The owners of the house claim that they try to treat the topic with the utmost respect, presenting facts without sensationalism. Many visitors to the house admit that their visit made them think about the nature of evil, how little we sometimes know about the people around us, and how quickly ordinary life can turn into a nightmare. For some, this becomes an occasion to reflect on their own safety and the safety of their loved ones. For others, it is just an interesting historical experience. Every year on the 10th of June, the anniversary of the tragedy, some people come to the house or cemetery where the victims are buried to honor their memory. They leave flowers, light candles, say prayers. These are simple acts of memory that show that even after more than 100 years, people have not forgotten about Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 children and 2 little Stillinger girls, whose lives were so cruelly cut short. Several times attempts were made to close the case officially, admitting that the killer would never be found. However, the Villisca police keep the case open, despite the fact that the active investigation has long been stopped. This means that theoretically, if new evidence emerges, the case could be reopened. While the likelihood of this happening is extremely low, it is symbolically important that justice for the victims is still theoretically possible. In recent years, artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies have begun to be used to analyze unsolved crimes. Some enthusiasts loaded all available data about the Villisca case into computer programs, trying to find patterns or connections that might have been missed by human investigators. So far, these attempts have not led to any breakthroughs, but they show that interest in the cause does not fade even in the digital age. Stories about the haunted house in Villisca have become an integral part of the culture of paranormal lovers. Many television programs about ghosts filmed episodes in this house, using various equipment to detect paranormal activity. The results of these studies range from allegedly recorded children's voices to strange readings from temperature sensors and electromagnetic detectors. Skeptics point out that older homes often make strange noises due to design features, temperature changes, and other natural causes. They also point out that human psychology is such that, knowing about a place's horrific history, people tend to interpret ordinary phenomena as something supernatural. However, ghost stories continue to attract visitors and add another layer of mystery to the house's already dark history. Some paranormal researchers claim that they have managed to contact the spirits of dead children or even the spirit of the killer. They tell stories of ghosts supposedly revealing details of that night to them or pointing to the identity of the perpetrator. Of course, none of these revelations have been supported by any objective evidence, but they have become part of the folklore surrounding the site. The Villisca murder case has also become a subject of study for students majoring in criminology and forensics. Many universities use this case as a historical example to teach investigative techniques and evidence analysis. Students learn what mistakes were made in the original investigation, how they could have acted differently, and what modern methods could have helped solve the crime. More than a century has passed since that horrific night in June 1912, but the mystery of the Moore family's murder remains unsolved. All the suspects died long ago, the witnesses passed away, and the physical evidence has hardly survived. The chances that we will ever know the truth about who committed this heinous crime are almost nil. Nevertheless, the story of Villisca continues to live. It reminds us that even in the quietest and safest places, evil can lurk. It shows how fragile our illusion of security is and how quickly ordinary life can turn into a nightmare. 8 innocent people, including 4 young children, went to bed that Sunday night, unaware that they would never wake up again. Josiah and Sarah Moore were ordinary people living an ordinary life in a small American town. Their children were just starting their life journey. They had so many opportunities, so many dreams ahead of them. Lena and Ina Stillinger just came to visit their friends, happy to have the opportunity to spend the night together. None of them deserved such a terrible fate. The story of this crime has become a warning to future generations about the importance of vigilance, the need to improve methods of investigating crimes, and the value of every human life. It was also a reminder that justice is not always attainable, that some mysteries can remain unsolved forever, and that sometimes evil escapes punishment. The house in Villisca still stands, keeping within its walls the memory of that terrible night. Visitors continue to come there, try to touch history, to feel the atmosphere of the place where one of the most mysterious tragedies of America took place. Everyone who enters this house takes with him not only impressions, but also questions that will never be answered. Perhaps this is the scariest part of this story. Not in the brutality of the crime, not in the number of victims, but in the fact that we will never know the truth. Somewhere out there, in the past, there was a man who committed this monstrous atrocity, and he took his secret with him to the grave. Justice for the victims has never been done, and their souls, if such things are to be believed, may still be seeking peace. Thank you for being with us on the Fear Files channel. Remember that sometimes the scariest stories are not fiction, but real events that happen to real people. Take care of yourself and your loved ones, because we never know what dangers may lie in wait for us, even in the safest places. See you again with the frightening secrets of the past.